Welcome to Stories of the Enslaved. Today's story uncovers a truth hidden for more than 200 years. She was purchased for one purpose alone: to bear children who would be sold. But what she did to her owner's bloodline was never meant to be found. This is a heavy and disturbing account, so pause for a moment, breathe, and listen closely. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with the city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps make sure these stories are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the summer of 2019, a 67-year-old woman named Margaret Whitmore Collins sat in a private medical office in Boston, Massachusetts. Her life had been built on certainty. She came from one of the oldest families in the American South. Her ancestors owned thousands of acres. They built banks, railroads, and textile mills. For nearly 2 centuries, the Whitmore name meant power, wealth, and legacy. But on that July afternoon, everything Margaret believed about her family was about to collapse. The doctor placed a folder on the desk between them. He did not smile. He did not offer small talk. He simply said the genetic results were back, and there was something he needed to explain. Margaret listened as the doctor described a rare hereditary condition affecting every living member of the Whitmore bloodline. It was a genetic anomaly causing progressive organ failure. It had appeared in her grandfather. It killed her father at 58. It took her brother at 61. And now the same markers were present in her own DNA, in her children's, and in her grandchildren's. The doctor said the condition was unusual. It did not follow normal inheritance patterns. It seemed to have entered the family in the 19th century and had strengthened with each generation rather than weakening. He said he had never seen anything quite like it. Margaret asked if there was a treatment. The doctor paused before answering. He said they could manage symptoms, but they could not cure what was written in her blood. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her study, surrounded by portraits of her ancestors. She looked at the face of Edmund Whitmore, her great-great-grandfather, the man who built the family fortune on a cotton plantation in South Carolina. She looked at his cold eyes and stern mouth, and for the first time in her life, she wondered what secrets that face was hiding. She decided to hire a genealogist. She needed to understand where this curse had come from. She needed to know why her family was dying. What she discovered over the next 18 months would reach back 182 years. To a small cabin on a plantation called Magnolia, to a 17-year-old girl named Ruth, purchased for a single purpose, and to a revenge so patient and so complete that it waited almost 2 centuries to be understood. This is that story. The year was 1842. The place was Charleston, South Carolina, one of the wealthiest cities in America. The source of that wealth was cotton, and the source of the cotton was the labor of enslaved people. By 1842, South Carolina had more enslaved people than free citizens. The economy, the culture, and the social order all depended on the continuation of slavery. In the center of Charleston stood a building that tourists today pass without knowing its history. It was called Ryan's Mart, one of the largest slave auction houses in the American South. The building had high ceilings and large windows to let in light. The floors were made of hard brick. The walls were thick enough to muffle the sounds from inside. Every Tuesday and Friday, enslaved people were brought to Ryan's Mart to be sold. They were made to stand on raised platforms, while buyers examined them like livestock. Men checked their teeth. Women had their bodies inspected for signs of childbearing. Children were separated from their mothers and sold to different buyers heading to different states. The records from Ryan's Mart still exist today. They are kept in archives at universities and historical societies across the South. And in those records, In the faded ink of an auctioneer's ledger dated September 14, 1842, there is an entry for a 17-year-old girl listed only as Ruth, female, healthy, suitable for breeding. She was sold for $420 to a man named Edmund Whitmore. Edmund Whitmore was 34 years old in 1842. He owned a plantation called Magnolia, located about 40 miles northwest of Charleston. The plantation covered 200 acres. Most of that land was dedicated to cotton, which was processed in a gin house near the main property and shipped down the Santee River to Charleston for export. Edmund had inherited Magnolia from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The Whitmores had been in South Carolina since before the Revolution. They considered themselves aristocrats, the natural rulers of the land and everything on it. But Edmund faced a problem many plantation owners faced in the 1840s. The international slave trade had been banned since 1808. It was now illegal to import enslaved people from Africa or the Caribbean. This meant the only way to increase the enslaved population was through birth. And birth meant plantation owners needed women who could produce children. This practice had a name. It was called breeding. Plantation owners selected women specifically for their ability to bear children. These children would either be kept to work on the plantation or sold to other slaveholders for profit. A healthy child could be sold for anywhere from $200 to $500. A woman who produced multiple children could generate thousands of dollars over her lifetime. Edmund Whitmore was a practical man. He understood numbers. And when he saw Ruth standing on that platform in Charleston, he saw an investment. Ruth had been born on a small farm in Virginia in 1825. Her mother, a woman named Abina, had been brought from the Gold Coast of Africa when she was a child. Abena had been sold 3 times before she was 20 and had lost 2 children to sale before Ruth was born. She knew what awaited her daughter. She knew the world they lived in offered no protection and no mercy. But Abina carried something with her from Africa that could not be sold or stolen. She carried knowledge. Her own mother had been a healer in their village, a woman who understood the properties of plants, the secrets of roots and leaves and bark. This knowledge had been passed down through generations of women, and Abina passed it to Ruth. From the time Ruth was old enough to walk, her mother taught her to recognize plants. She learned which leaves could reduce fever. She learned which roots could ease the pain of childbirth. She learned which berries could help a person sleep, and which could stop a heart if given in the wrong amount. Abena made Ruth memorize everything. She said that knowledge was the only thing they could never take away. Ruth was 12 years old when her mother was sold to a buyer from Georgia. She never saw Abina again, but she kept everything her mother had taught her locked inside her mind like a treasure no one could touch. For the next 5 years, Ruth worked on a tobacco farm in Virginia. She was quiet and obedient. She did what she was told. She never spoke back. She never caused trouble. And she never let anyone see what she was really thinking. In September of 1842, the tobacco farm was sold and all the enslaved people were taken to Charleston to be auctioned. Ruth stood on the platform at Ryan's Mart and watched the white faces looking up at her. She watched them discussing her body like she was a horse or a piece of furniture. And she watched Edmund Whitmore raise his hand and buy her. She did not know it then, but she had just met the man whose bloodline she would destroy. Magnolia Plantation sat at the end of a long road lined with oak trees. The main house was a 2-story building with white columns and wide porches. Behind it stood the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the dairy, and the workshops. Further back, past the gardens and the stables, were the slave quarters, a row of small wooden cabins with dirt floors and no windows. Ruth arrived at Magnolia in late September of 1842. She was taken directly to a cabin at the end of the row and told this would be her home. The cabin had one room, a single bed made of rope and straw, and a fireplace that did not work properly. The roof leaked when it rained. The walls let in the cold, but Ruth was not expected to spend much time in her cabin. Within 2 weeks of her arrival, she was summoned to the main house. Edmund Whitmore's wife, a woman named Constance, was present when Ruth arrived. Constance was a thin woman with pale skin and nervous hands. She did not look at Ruth directly. She kept her eyes on the floor, while her husband explained what was expected. Edmund said Ruth had been purchased for a specific purpose. She was young and healthy. She would bear children. Those children would belong to him to do with as he saw fit. She would be given adequate food and shelter as long as she remained productive. If she caused trouble or failed to conceive, she would be sold further south to the cotton fields of Mississippi or Louisiana, where life expectancy for enslaved people was measured in years, not decades. Ruth stood in silence and listened. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply nodded and said, "Yes, sir," when he was finished. That night, Edmund Whitmore came to her cabin for the first time. Over the next 7 years, Ruth gave birth to 5 children. The first was a boy born in the summer of 1843. Edmund named him Samuel. The second was a girl born in 1844. She was named Mary. The third was another boy in 1846 named Thomas. The fourth was a girl in 1847 named Sarah. The fifth was a boy in 1849 named Joseph. Ruth nursed each of her children until they were weaned. She held them. She sang to them in the language her mother had taught her. Words from a homeland she had never seen but carried in her blood. She loved them with a ferocity she kept hidden from everyone around her. But she also knew none of them would stay with her. The children were sold as soon as they were old enough to be useful. Samuel was sold at age 7 to a plantation in Alabama. Mary was sold at age 6 to a household in Savannah. Thomas, Sarah, and Joseph followed in turn. Each time, Ruth watched her children being led away in chains, and each time she felt something inside her harden like stone. Edmund Whitmore kept careful records of these transactions. The records still exist in the Whitmore family papers, donated to the South Carolina Historical Society in 1952. They show Edmund earned a total of $2,800 from the sale of Ruth's children. He considered this an excellent return on his original investment. What the records do not show is what Ruth was thinking during those 7 years. They do not show the plans forming in her mind. They do not show the anger building behind her quiet eyes. But there was another set of records Edmund did not know about. Ruth was keeping her own account, written not on paper, but in memory. And in that account, a debt was growing that would take generations to repay. In the spring of 1850, something changed at Magnolia Plantation. Constance Whitmore, Edmund's wife, had been sick for years. She suffered from what the doctors called female complaints, a common way of saying they did not know what was wrong. She spent most of her days in her bedroom taking laudanum for the pain and receiving visits from a series of physicians who prescribed various cures that never worked. But in March of 1850, Constance's condition suddenly improved. The change was remarkable. She began eating again. She started leaving her room. She even walked in the gardens for the first time in 2 years. The cause of this improvement was a tea Ruth had begun preparing for her. Ruth had approached the house cook, an older woman named Esther, and suggested she knew a remedy that might help the mistress. Esther was skeptical at first, but she had seen enough of Ruth's quiet competence over the years to trust her. She brought the tea to Constance, who drank it and found her pain diminished within hours. From that day forward, Ruth prepared a special tea for Constance every morning. She also began preparing tonics for other members of the household. She made a digestive remedy for Edmund's elderly mother, who lived in a cottage on the property. She made a sleep aid for Edmund himself, who complained of restlessness. She made strengthening drinks for the Whitmore children. Edmund's 3 legitimate sons, who would inherit the plantation. Everyone in the main house came to rely on Ruth's remedies. They trusted her. They called her Good Ruth, and remarked on how lucky they were to have such a skilled woman in their possession. None of them asked what was in the drinks. None of them questioned why Ruth had suddenly become so helpful to the family that had stolen her children. Ruth never told them. She simply smiled, bowed her head, and kept preparing her specialties. The knowledge Ruth's mother had passed down included more than healing remedies. It also included information about plants that could harm, substances that could weaken the body over time without leaving obvious traces. Among the plants that grew wild in the Carolina Low Country was one called pokeweed. In small amounts, pokeweed could be used as a purgative. In larger amounts, over extended periods, it could cause lasting damage to the blood and internal organs. Another plant called bloodroot could cause similar effects. There were others, too. Plants with names Ruth knew only in her mother's language. Plants used in Africa for purposes never written down, but passed from mother to daughter through generations. Ruth did not use enough of any single substance to cause immediate illness. She was too careful for that. She used amounts so small they would not be noticed, combinations so subtle no doctor would ever identify them. She measured everything by instinct and experience, adjusting her recipes based on the reactions she observed. The effects would not appear right away. They would take years to manifest, and even then they would look like natural illness, like the kind of weakness that runs in families. No one would ever trace them back to the quiet woman who prepared the morning tea. But Ruth knew. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was not trying to kill Edmund Whitmore, or his wife, or his mother. Killing them would only bring suspicion and punishment. She was doing something far more devastating. She was planting seeds of destruction in their bloodline. Alterations that would be passed from parent to child, weaknesses that would compound with each generation until the Whitmore family simply ceased to exist. Her children had been taken from her and sold like animals. The Whitmore children would never have children of their own, or if they did, those children would be sickly and short-lived. The family that had profited from her suffering would pay with the only thing they truly valued, their legacy. Ruth was patient. She had learned patience in the fields and the auction houses and the cabin where Edmund Whitmore came to her at night. She knew she would not live to see her revenge completed. But she also knew some debts take generations to collect, and she was willing to wait. By 1855, the effects of Ruth's work were beginning to show, though no one connected them to her. Edmund Whitmore's eldest son, William, had always been a healthy boy. But in his late teens, he began experiencing fatigue and unexplained bleeding. Doctors were called from Charleston, and even from as far as Philadelphia. They examined William and diagnosed him with a blood disorder of unknown origin. They prescribed rest and iron supplements. They said he would likely recover. William did not recover. He died in 1857, 2 months after his 21st birthday. Edmund's second son, Charles, showed similar symptoms beginning in his early 20s. He managed to marry and father 2 children before his health declined. He died in 1863 during the Civil War, though not from any battle wound. He simply collapsed one day and never woke up. The third son, Henry, lived the longest. He survived the war and even managed the plantation during the difficult years of Reconstruction. But he never married and never had children. He told people he was not interested in family life. But those who knew him well said he was afraid. He had watched his brothers die. He did not want to pass whatever curse they carried to another generation. Henry died in 1889, alone in the house where he had been born. With his death, the direct male line of Edmund Whitmore came to an end. But the family did not disappear entirely. Charles's 2 children, both daughters, had married and carried the Whitmore blood into new families. The genetic damage Ruth had introduced continued to spread, manifesting in different ways in different generations, but always present, always waiting. Ruth herself lived until 1881. She was 66 years old when she died, an unusually long life for someone who had spent her youth in slavery. She witnessed the end of slavery in 1865. She witnessed the brief hope of Reconstruction, when black men could vote and hold office and own land. And she witnessed the violent end of that hope as white Southerners reasserted control through terror and legislation. After the war, Ruth left Magnolia Plantation and settled in a small community of freed people near Charleston. She worked as a healer, using the knowledge her mother had given her to help her neighbors. She delivered babies, treated fevers, and sat with the dying as they passed. She never married. She never had more children. The 5 children she had born had been scattered across the South, and she spent years trying to find them. She located 2 of them, Samuel and Sarah, who had survived slavery and the war. She saw them again before she died. She held her grandchildren. But she never told anyone what she had done to the Whitmore family. She kept that secret buried deep inside her, a private victory she carried to her grave, or almost to her grave. A few weeks before she died, Ruth called her granddaughter to her bedside. The granddaughter's name was Patience, and she was 16 years old. Ruth told Patience there was something she needed to know, a story that had never been told but deserved to be remembered. Ruth told her everything. She told her about the cabin at Magnolia. She told her about her children being sold. She told her about the teas and the tonics and the slow revenge she had planted in the Whitmore blood. She told her granddaughter to write it all down so that someday, when the Whitmore family finally understood what had happened to them, someone would know the truth. Patience wrote the story in a small leather notebook. She wrote it in English, because that was the only language she knew. But she kept the book hidden because she understood how dangerous such a document could be. If white people found it, if they read what Ruth had done, there was no telling what might happen. Patience kept the notebook her entire life. When she died in 1921, she passed it to her own daughter. The daughter passed it to her daughter in turn. The notebook traveled through generations, always hidden, always protected, always waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The Whitmore family, meanwhile, continued its slow decline. Charles's descendants spread across the South and eventually to the North. They changed their names through marriage. They moved to new cities and started new businesses. They had no idea they carried Ruth's legacy in their blood. But the effects continued in each generation. There were premature deaths. There were unexplained illnesses. There were couples who tried for years to have children and never succeeded. The pattern was there for anyone who cared to look. But no one looked. The connections between distant cousins were too faint. The family was too scattered, and the original cause was too far in the past. By the 20th century, the Whitmore name had almost faded from history. The plantation called Magnolia had been sold and divided and sold again. The main house burned down in 1911 and was never rebuilt. The slave cabins had been demolished to make way for tenant farming operations. Only the family papers survived. donated to the Historical Society by a descendant who had no idea what secrets they contained. And Ruth's notebook waited, passed from hand to hand through generations of her descendants, waiting for the day when it would finally be read by someone who would understand. That day came in 2020, when Margaret Whitmore Collins began searching for answers to her family's curse. Margaret had hired a genealogist named David Okonkwo to trace her family history. David was a professor of African American history at Howard University, who specialized in using genetic databases and historical records to reconnect families separated by slavery. He was exactly the kind of person who might find connections others had missed. David began his research with standard sources. He examined census records, property transfers, birth and death certificates, and military records. He traced the Whitmore family back through generations, documenting marriages and births and deaths. He confirmed the pattern Margaret had described, the unusual concentration of illness and early death that seemed to follow the Whitmore bloodline. But when he reached the 19th century, he found something unexpected. He found records of enslaved people at Magnolia Plantation. He found bills of sale and auction records and plantation inventories. And in those records, he found the name Ruth. David Cross referenced Ruth's information with genetic databases built from DNA samples submitted by people searching for their ancestry. He found matches. He found descendants. And when he contacted those descendants, one of them told him about a notebook passed down through her family for over a century. The notebook was brought to David's office in a cardboard box, wrapped in old cloth. It was small, no bigger than a man's hand, with a leather cover cracked and faded with age. The pages inside were fragile and yellowed, covered in handwriting difficult to read. David spent 3 weeks transcribing the notebook. When he finished, he sat alone in his office for a long time, trying to decide what to do with what he had learned. Then, he called Margaret Whitmore Collins and told her he had found the answer she was looking for. He said she should probably sit down before he continued. Margaret flew to Washington the following week. She met David in his office at Howard University. He handed her a copy of the transcription and watched her face as she read. The notebook began with a simple statement. My grandmother's name was Ruth. She was bought for breeding in 1842. This is what she did. What followed was the story Ruth had told her granddaughter Patience in 1881. It was the story of the teas and the tonics, the slow poisoning Ruth had administered over years, the deliberate destruction of the Whitmore bloodline. It explained everything Margaret's doctors had been unable to understand. At the end of the notebook, written in a different hand that must have been added later, there was a single line. She said they sold her children, so she made sure their children would end. She said some debts take a long time to pay. Margaret read the notebook twice. Then she set it down and looked at David Okonkwo. She asked if this was real. She asked if what the notebook described was even possible. David said he had consulted with medical historians and geneticists. He said while the specific mechanisms Ruth described were not scientifically precise, the general principle was sound. Certain toxic substances, particularly heavy metals and plant alkaloids, could cause genetic damage that persisted across generations. This was called epigenetic modification, and it was a real phenomenon scientists were only beginning to understand. He said, Ruth may not have understood the science of what she was doing, but she understood the practice. Her mother had taught her techniques, developed over generations in Africa. Techniques for influencing health and reproduction that European medicine would not discover for another century and a half. David paused. Then he said there was one more thing Margaret should know. He said Ruth's descendants had been traced through the genetic databases. There were living members of Ruth's family, people who carried her blood just as Margaret carried the blood of Edmund Whitmore, and one of those descendants had agreed to meet with Margaret if she wanted. Margaret said yes. She wanted to meet them. The meeting took place 2 weeks later in Charleston, South Carolina, in a hotel conference room overlooking the harbor where slave ships had once unloaded their cargo. Margaret arrived first. She sat at the table and waited, her hands folded in front of her. She had spent the past 2 weeks thinking about what she would say. She had rehearsed speeches about reconciliation and understanding. She had prepared herself to apologize for what her ancestors had done. But when the door opened and Ruth's descendant walked in, all Margaret's prepared words disappeared. The woman's name was Grace Williams. She was 71 years old, 4 years older than Margaret. She had gray hair and dark skin and eyes that seemed to look straight through everything they saw. She was a retired schoolteacher from Atlanta who had spent her career teaching Black history to children, never told the truth about their past. Grace sat down across from Margaret. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Grace reached into her bag and pulled out the original notebook, the one Patience had written in 1881. She placed it on the table between them. She said her family had kept this notebook for almost 140 years. She said they had always known what it contained, but never known what to do with it. Some relatives wanted to destroy it. Some wanted to publish it. Most simply wanted to keep it hidden and let the past stay buried. But Grace had made a different decision. She decided the truth needed to be told, not for revenge, but for understanding. She said, Ruth's story was part of American history, a piece of the past deliberately erased and forgotten. She said bringing it to light was a way of honoring Ruth's memory and the memory of all the women like her who had suffered and resisted and survived. Grace pushed the notebook across the table toward Margaret. She said she wanted Margaret to have it. She said it belonged to both their families now. She said Ruth's revenge was complete, and holding on to anger would not change what had already happened. Margaret picked up the notebook. She held it carefully, feeling the weight of 2 centuries in her hands. She asked Grace if she was angry. She asked if she blamed Margaret for what Edmund Whitmore had done. Grace thought about the question a long time before answering. She said anger was a fire that burned the person who carried it. She said Ruth carried her anger for 40 years, and it consumed her life just as surely as it consumed the Whitmores. She said both families had been prisoners of the same history, trapped by choices made before any of them were born. But she also said understanding was not the same as forgiveness. She said what Edmund Whitmore had done, what the whole system of slavery had done, was unforgivable. It could not be erased or made right by any act of reconciliation. The only thing they could do was acknowledge it, learn from it, and make sure it was never forgotten. Margaret nodded. She understood. She asked Grace what happened to Ruth's children. The 5 sold away from her. She asked if Grace knew where they had ended up. Grace said she knew about 2 of them, Samuel and Sarah, who reconnected with Ruth after the war. Their descendants were part of Grace's family. But the other 3, Mary, Thomas, and Joseph, had been lost. Their trail ended at the auction houses where they were sold. There were no records of where they went or what happened to them. Grace said this was the true legacy of slavery. It was not just the suffering of those enslaved. It was the destruction of families, the severing of connections that could never be repaired. Millions of people had been scattered across the continent, and their descendants were still searching for each other today. Margaret looked down at the notebook in her hands. She thought about her own family, the doctors and genetic tests, and the fear of what would happen to her grandchildren. She thought about Ruth, a 17-year-old girl standing on an auction platform, watching her future decided by strangers. She asked Grace one final question. She asked what Ruth would have wanted if she could see them sitting here together. Grace smiled for the first time since entering the room. She said Ruth would have wanted to be remembered. She would have wanted people to know her name and her story. She would have wanted the world to understand that enslaved people were not passive victims. They resisted. They fought back in whatever ways they could. And sometimes their resistance outlasted the people who tried to destroy them. Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she had made a decision. She said she would make sure Ruth's story was told. She would donate the notebook to a museum. She would fund research into the Whitmore plantation records. She would do everything in her power to ensure Ruth's name would not be forgotten. Grace reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. She held it for a moment. Two old women connected by a history they had not chosen but could not escape. Then Grace stood up, gathered her things, and walked out of the room without looking back. Margaret sat alone a long time, holding the notebook and watching the sunset over Charleston Harbor. The story of Ruth and the Whitmore family did not end in that Charleston hotel room. In many ways, it was only beginning to be understood. After her meeting with Grace Williams, Margaret Whitmore Collins returned to Boston and began the work she promised. She contacted historians, archivists, and museum curators. She opened the Whitmore family papers to researchers for the first time. She funded a project to digitize plantation records from across the South Carolina Lowcountry, making them available to anyone searching for ancestors who had been enslaved. But Margaret also began a more personal investigation. She wanted to understand not just what Ruth had done, but how. She wanted to know how a 17-year-old girl with no formal education possessed knowledge sophisticated enough to alter the genetic destiny of an entire family. The answer took her far beyond South Carolina, back across the Atlantic to the coast of West Africa, to a tradition of knowledge that survived the Middle Passage and continued to influence American history in ways most people never recognized. Ruth's mother, Abina, had been born around 1800 in a region now part of modern Ghana. She came from a community where women held specific roles as healers and herbalists. This was not unusual in West African societies. In many cultures along the Gold Coast, medical knowledge was passed from mother to daughter through generations of careful teaching. The women who held this knowledge were not simply folk healers mixing random plants. They were trained practitioners who understood the properties of hundreds of substances. They knew which plants could cure and which could kill. They knew how to prepare medicines that acted immediately and others that worked slowly over time. They knew how to combine ingredients to produce effects no single substance could achieve alone. When Abina was captured and sold into slavery around 1810, she carried this knowledge with her. It was invisible to slave traders who examined her body for signs of health and strength. It was invisible to plantation owners who purchased her. But it was the most valuable thing she possessed, more valuable than any physical skill or labor she could provide. Abena taught everything she knew to her daughter Ruth. She began lessons when Ruth was barely old enough to walk, pointing out plants in fields and forests, explaining their properties in whispered conversations at night. She made Ruth memorize hundreds of combinations and preparations. She tested her daughter constantly, asking her to identify plants by sight and smell, quizzing her on dosages and methods. by the time Ruth was 12, when Abena was sold away and the two separated forever. Ruth had absorbed a lifetime of medical knowledge. She knew more about the human body and its responses to different substances than most trained physicians in America. And she knew how to use that knowledge as a weapon. The specific methods Ruth employed at Magnolia were reconstructed by researchers who studied her notebook and compared it to historical records of African medicinal practices. Ruth's primary tool was a combination of plant-based compounds now classified as mutagens, substances capable of causing changes to DNA. The most significant was a preparation derived from pokeweed, a plant native to the eastern United States, but similar to species used in West African medicine. Pokeweed contains chemicals called mutagens that affect how cells divide and reproduce. In small doses, they can stimulate the immune system. In larger doses over extended periods, they can cause cumulative damage to cellular reproduction. Damage passed from parent to child through what scientists now call epigenetic modification. Ruth combined pokeweed with other substances, including preparations from bloodroot and certain fungi growing in damp corners of plantation buildings. She adjusted mixtures based on responses she observed, increasing or decreasing concentrations to achieve desired effects while avoiding detection. The genius of Ruth's approach was its gradualism. She never administered enough to cause immediate illness. Instead, she created a slow accumulation of damage only apparent years or decades later. By the time the Whitmore family began to sicken and die, Ruth was long beyond suspicion. She was simply the quiet woman who made the morning tea. Medical historians reviewing Whitmore family records found patterns consistent with Ruth's methods. The deaths showed signatures of cumulative toxic exposure, combined with inherited genetic damage. The specific combination of symptoms, bleeding disorders, organ failure, reproductive problems, matched what would be expected from the substances Ruth described. One researcher, a geneticist at Duke University named Dr. Sarah Mensah, spent 3 years studying the case. She concluded Ruth essentially invented a form of genetic warfare more than a century before science existed to explain it. Ruth may not have understood DNA or inheritance mechanisms, but she understood practical effects. She knew damage to parents would be reflected in children, and she used that knowledge with devastating precision. Dr. Mensah published findings in a medical journal in 2022. The article attracted significant attention for scientific implications and historical significance. It demonstrated enslaved Africans brought sophisticated medical knowledge to America, knowledge dismissed and forgotten by a society refusing to recognize their humanity or intelligence. But Ruth's story was not only revenge. It was also survival resistance and unbreakable bonds between mother and child. After meeting Grace Williams, Margaret became obsessed with finding Ruth's lost children. She hired investigators and genealogists. She searched auction records and slave manifests. She submitted DNA samples to every database that would accept them. The search took 4 years. Most led nowhere. Records from the antebellum South were incomplete, often deliberately destroyed. Many enslaved people were listed only by first name, making them impossible to trace. Others were sold multiple times, trails disappearing into interstate slave trade chaos. But in 2024, Margaret's team found a lead. Among Ryan's Mart records, they discovered a ledger from 1849 showing sale of a 6-year-old boy named Joseph to a plantation in Mississippi. The buyer was Cornelius Drake. Price, the $275. The Drake plantation was near Natchez, Mississippi, one of the wealthiest districts in the antebellum South. Unlike many plantations, the Drake family kept detailed records of enslaved workers, including births, deaths, and family relationships. These records were preserved by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Margaret's researchers found Joseph in Drake records. He arrived at the plantation fall 1849, assigned to cotton fields. He survived childhood, which many enslaved children did not. He grew to adulthood and married a woman named Dina in 1865, months after the Civil War ended. Joseph and Dina had 7 children. Their descendants numbered in the hundreds. Through 21st century genetic databases, those descendants could be traced and contacted. Margaret located Joseph's living descendants, scattered from Mississippi to California to New York. She contacted them one by one, explaining who she was and what she discovered. Most never heard of Ruth or Magnolia. They only knew ancestors were enslaved somewhere in the South. When Margaret told Ruth's story, when she explained they were descendants of a woman who struck back against oppressors in a way never documented in history books, reactions varied. Some were proud, some shocked, some angry it took so long for truth to come out. But all wanted to know more. Discovery of Joseph's descendants led to an even more remarkable finding. Among Joseph's great-grandchildren was a woman named Rosalind Carter, a retired nurse in Oakland, California. Rosalind was 73 when Margaret contacted her. She spent her career working in community health clinics, serving populations mainstream medicine often ignored. When Rosalind heard Ruth's story, she began to cry. She said everything suddenly made sense. Rosalind explained her grandmother, Joseph's granddaughter, was a healer in their rural Mississippi community. She knew plants and remedies nobody else understood. She delivered babies, treated illnesses, helped people die with dignity. And she always said her knowledge came from her grandmother, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from Africa. The knowledge Abina passed to Ruth did not die with Ruth. It survived through Joseph, through his children and grandchildren, through generations of women preserving and practicing what they inherited. The tradition giving Ruth power to destroy the Whitmore bloodline also gave her descendants power to heal. Rosalind still had notebooks her grandmother kept, filled with recipes and preparations, passed down through the family. Researchers examining these notebooks found remarkable parallels to substances described in Ruth's notebook. The knowledge evolved and adapted over generations, but origins in West African medicine were unmistakable. Dr. Mensah became interested in Rosalind's notebooks. She realized they represented a living tradition of African American folk medicine never properly documented or studied. She applied for grants to support further research and collaborated with ethnobotanists and medical historians to understand this tradition's full scope. The work is ongoing. It already yielded important findings about plant-based medicines with potential applications in modern healthcare. More importantly, it demonstrated knowledge enslaved Africans brought to America was not lost. It was preserved, adapted, and passed down through generations, refusing to let heritage be destroyed. As Ruth's story spread beyond academic journals into public consciousness, it attracted different reactions. For many African Americans, Ruth became a symbol of resistance. Her story demonstrated enslaved people did not simply endure bondage passively. They fought back in visible and invisible ways, using whatever tools they possessed. Ruth had no weapons, no army, no political power. She had only knowledge and patience. With those tools, she brought down a dynasty. Churches and community organizations began telling Ruth's story during Black History Month. Artists created paintings and sculptures depicting her. Musicians wrote songs. A Chicago playwright developed a stage production based on her life, touring regional theaters across the Midwest. But the story also attracted criticism. Some historians questioned if Ruth's methods could really produce described effects. They argued epigenetics was poorly understood and claims about Ruth's abilities exaggerated or impossible. They suggested Whitmore family decline might result from ordinary genetic disorders unrelated to Ruth's interventions. Others raised moral objections. They argued celebrating Ruth's revenge was problematic, poisoning people wrong regardless of circumstances. They worried holding Ruth up as a hero would encourage vigilante justice or violence against perceived oppressors. Debates played out in academic conferences, newspaper opinion pages, and social media. They reflected deeper disagreements about understanding American history, assigning moral responsibility for past crimes, and telling stories about people denied opportunity to tell their own. Margaret followed debates with interest. She spent her life as a beneficiary of Whitmore fortune. Money built on backs of enslaved people like Ruth. She was raised proud of her family name. Now she was forced to reckon with what that name meant. In a 2023 Boston newspaper interview, Margaret said learning Ruth's story was the most important experience of her life. It forced her to understand history was not something happening long ago to other people. It shaped the present, living in bodies, bloodlines, family traditions. Choices her ancestors made still affected people today, including herself. She said she did not blame Ruth. Ruth was placed in an impossible situation and responded with only weapons available. If the Whitmore family was cursed, they brought it upon themselves. Margaret died in 2025 at 73. Her death was caused by the same genetic disorder, claiming many relatives. Her will left bulk of her estate to a foundation researching slavery history in South Carolina and supporting descendants of enslaved people who labored on Whitmore land. The foundation was named after Ruth. The cabin where Ruth lived at Magnolia no longer exists. It was demolished early 20th century, with other slave quarters for agricultural operations since abandoned. But the site can still be identified. 40 miles northwest of Charleston on land, now owned by South Carolina, managed as a historical preserve. In 2024, University of South Carolina archaeologists excavated the site. They searched for artifacts shedding light on daily lives of enslaved people at Magnolia. What they found exceeded expectations. Beneath soil where Ruth's cabin stood, they discovered a small collection of objects deliberately buried. There were pottery pieces, including bowl fragments showing signs of grinding herbs. There were seeds from several plants, including pokeweed and bloodroot, preserved in a small clay container. And there was a single piece of cloth rotted almost to nothing, but recognizable as part of a garment. The most significant discovery was a small stone figure about 3 inches tall, carved in a style originating in West Africa. The figure represented a female form with exaggerated features symbolizing fertility and protection. Similar figures found at other slave sites across the South suggest enslaved people maintained connections to African spiritual traditions despite owners' efforts to erase their culture. Archaeologists theorized Ruth buried these objects as a ritual, preserving heritage and perhaps calling on spiritual powers to aid her work. Whether one believed in such powers, objects demonstrated Ruth maintained identity and connections to Africa throughout enslavement. Artifacts from Ruth's cabin are displayed at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. They are accompanied by detailed explanation of Ruth's story based on her notebook and subsequent research. Visitors see the bowl she used to grind herbs, the seeds she collected, the figure she carved or inherited from her mother. They can read her words transcribed from Patience's 1881 notebook, telling the story of a woman refusing to accept her fate. The last Whitmore family member carrying the genetic disorder Ruth introduced died in 2031. His name was Thomas Whitmore Blake, Margaret's grandson. He was 34. Thomas knew Ruth's story since his teens. His grandmother told him everything, showed him the notebook, explained what it meant for their family. He lived his entire adult life knowing his blood carried a curse he could not escape. In pre-death interviews, Thomas said he did not feel anger toward Ruth. He understood why she did what she did. His family committed crimes against humanity for generations and never held accountable. Ruth simply provided accountability the legal system never would. Thomas hoped his death would mark an end. He hoped with extinction of Whitmore bloodline, some portion of debt ancestors incurred might finally be paid. He knew no suffering could undo harm done to Ruth and millions like her, but he hoped their story might warn future generations about consequences of treating human beings as property. Thomas died without children. He chose not to have them, knowing he would pass his condition to any offspring. With his death, Edmund Whitmore's direct bloodline ended, 189 years after Ruth was sold on Charleston's auction platform. The curse was complete, but the story does not end with death. It ends with memory, with determination of survivors to ensure what happened is never forgotten. Ruth's descendants, traced through son Joseph and daughter Sarah, now number in thousands. They hold reunions sharing photographs, documents, DNA results, piecing together branches of a family tree slavery tried to destroy. They created websites and social media groups exchanging information and support. They established scholarship funds for young people, studying African American history or medicine. Every year on the anniversary of Ruth's death in 1881, her descendants gather for a memorial service. They come from across the country, big cities, small towns, every walk of life. They share stories about their ancestor, her courage, intelligence, determination to resist. They read passages from her notebook. They sing songs passed down through generations. At the 2030 gathering in Charleston near Ryan's Mart, where Ruth was sold, more than 300 descendants attended. They ranged from infants to elders in their 90s. They represented every shade of brown and black, a living testament to diversity and resilience of African American families. Grace Williams, who first shared Ruth's notebook with Margaret, was 92 and unable to travel. But she sent a message read aloud. Ruth taught me something important about justice. Justice is not always swift or visible. Sometimes it takes generations. Sometimes people who deserve it never live to see it. But justice has its own timeline. Those who commit wrongs should never assume they escaped consequences simply because consequences are delayed. Ruth was patient. She understood revenge would not be completed in her lifetime. She accepted she would never see Whitmore family brought low, but she trusted the process she started, trusting seeds she planted would eventually bear fruit. And they have. Every Whitmore who suffered, every child never born, every branch of the family tree withered and died. All harvest of seeds Ruth planted nearly 2 centuries before. This is the lesson I pass to future generations. Evil may seem powerful, but it carries seeds of its own destruction. Those profiting from cruelty eventually pay the price, even if price takes lifetimes to collect. And those who suffered will be remembered, their stories told and retold, until they become permanent record of human experience. Ruth did not destroy the Whitmore family. She made them destroy themselves. She turned their greed and cruelty back against them. She used the system oppressing her as instrument of her revenge. And doing so, she demonstrated something slaveholders always feared but never admitted. The people they enslaved were not inferior, not less intelligent, less capable, less human. They were simply people denied opportunity to show what they could do. Ruth showed what she could do, and her legacy will live forever. In South Carolina Historical Society archives, among Whitmore family papers, there is a letter written in 1865, just after the Civil War. written by Henry Whitmore, Edmund's last surviving son, to a cousin in Virginia. It describes Magnolia's condition after war and his future plans. He mentions freed people once enslaved on the property, noting most left to start new lives elsewhere. But one passage stands out. Henry writes about a woman named Ruth, one of his father's slaves many years. He says Ruth left immediately after war ended without saying goodbye or taking belongings offered. He says he always found Ruth strange. She had a way of looking at people making him uncomfortable. He says he was not sorry to see her go. The letter was written decades before Henry's death, before Whitmore's decline, before anyone understood what Ruth did. Henry had no idea the woman he found strange had already sealed his family's fate. He had no idea Ruth's quiet departure was not retreat, but victory. She finished her work. Nothing left for her at Magnolia. The teas had been served. The seeds had been planted. The rest was simply a matter of time. Ruth walked away from Magnolia Plantation, spring 1865, and never looked back. She arrived as property. She left as author of her own destiny, carrying a secret outliving everyone who tried to own her. This is the story of Ruth. She was born into slavery and died a free woman. She lost 5 children to the auction block and lived to hold grandchildren. She possessed knowledge oppressors never suspected and used it to achieve revenge, taking almost 200 years to complete. She never wrote a book or gave a speech or led a rebellion. She never appeared in any newspaper or historical account during her lifetime. She was simply one of millions enslaved who lived and suffered and died in a system designed to erase their humanity. But she refused to be erased. She found a way to fight back with the only weapons she had. And her fight outlasted people who thought they conquered her. History is full of stories like Ruth's. Stories never written down because people living them were not considered worth remembering. Every plantation in the South had its Ruth. Someone resisting in visible or invisible ways. Someone preserving dignity and heritage against all odds. Most stories are lost forever. People gone, memories died with them. But every now and then a story survives. A notebook passed down. An archaeologist digs in the right place. A descendant decides to share what they know. And when that happens, we are reminded history is not just the story of the powerful. It is also the story of those supposed to be forgotten, but refused to disappear. Ruth refused to disappear. And now, almost 2 centuries after her death, she is finally being seen. Not as victim, not as property, but as what she always was, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and courage who faced impossible circumstances and found a way to prevail. Her story is not forgiveness. It is not a comfortable story wrapping up neatly with reconciliation and healing. It is a story of rage and patience and determination to make guilty pay for crimes. Whether that makes Ruth a hero or something more complicated is a question each person must answer. But what cannot be denied is Ruth's story is true. It matters, and it deserves to be told. The Whitmore family thought they owned her. They were wrong.